Thanks, Diana, and thank you, Anselm, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to contribute something to this, I think, totally amazing exhibition. One thing I should say, one change from the advertised talk, I'm not really going to speak about Tom McCarthy's remainder, but maybe I'll speak about it a bit in the Q&A if people want me to. In considering the relationship between quantified life and sociality, my thoughts turn not only to computation, but also to capital. While it's incredibly useful to track the intensifying relationship between quantification and sociality from Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Murray's experiments in motion capture through the industrial efficiency projects of Frederick Winslow Taylor and Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, and into the complex of financialization algorithms and precarious labor that characterizes the so-called post-industrial economy, I think that it's important to also place these developments upon a longer history, what Frederick Jameson calls the uninterrupted narrative of capitalist accumulation and its concomitant social formations. Might we admit that Marx remains one of the preeminent theorists of the quantification of sociality? Consider, for example, this famous passage from Volume 1 of Capital. Here, Marx considers what happens through the processes in which matter and activity become crystallized or congealed in a commodity form. So Marx writes, if we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see in it no longer a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. Neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of the labour of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or any other definite kind of productive labour. Along with the useful qualities of the products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labour embodied in them and the concrete forms of that labour. There is nothing left but what is common to them all, reduced to one and the same sort of labour, human labour in the abstract. In the process of value production, in which human activity and materials are equally reduced to numeric values, all that is concrete or sensuous disappears. All that remains is a web of values on a single scale, ready for exchange. This is why, for Marx, the human worker caught in circuits of exchange is reduced to what he calls a dot-like isolation, punctualitat. From this point of view, the world of bodies and objects already looks like a cybernetic system. Might we then understand capitalism itself as a form of computation and the capture of the concrete and the sensuous as one of the preconditions for such a system? This appears to be what Gayatri Spivak is suggesting when she writes, according to Marx, under capitalism, value is produced in necessary and value as produced in necessary and surplus labour is computed as the representation and sign of objectified labour, which is rigorously distinguished from human activity. Two things strike me as especially important here. The first is the use of computation to describe a technical process through which human activity becomes quantified as value in a specific way, but which has no necessary connection to computing machinery as such. And the second is the parenthetical reminder that objectified labour is radically different from human activity in general. In transforming the latter into the former, something is lost. The processing of human activity into surplus value is not, however, the only register at which human life is quantified under capitalism, as this passage from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass ought to remind us. So here the narrator is sent from Baltimore to Tuckahoe, Maryland, in order to be recorded as a cash value because his master has died unexpectedly without leaving a will. And Douglass writes, "We were all ranked together at the valuation. Men and women, old and young, married and single, were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being, and were all subject to the same narrow examination. Silvery-headed age and sprightly youth, maids and matrons had to undergo the same indelicate inspection. At this moment, I saw more clearly than ever the brutalizing effects of slavery." This passage clarifies the way in which capitalism does not simply imply a single monolithic approach for computing life as value. There are protocols for extracting value from life defined as human and productive, and there are protocols for extracting value from bodies of those defined as non-human and non-productive. For the former, it is activity or interaction that generates value. For the latter, which is exemplified by slavery and its ongoing legacies, the person is reduced to a resource to be bought and sold or acted upon. Critically, those people and things that are excluded from networks of activity-based value formation and exchange are not accidental byproducts or elements external to capital as such. They are the very precondition for capitalist accumulation in general. So while it's important to think through the ways in which aesthetic works register and critique systems of quantification as they operate in economy and governance, we should also be attentive to the ways in which such arrangements operate through exclusion and suspension, as well as through inclusion and representation. So we'll say more about this later, but for now I want to think about the ways in which relationships between technology and aesthetic production can help us to think through the complex of capital, computation, exploitation, and exclusion. On November 13th, 1947, the engineer Frank Gray filed a patent for what would come to be called Gray code, a method of coding numbers that was optimized for a representation by arrangements of open or closed electromechanical switches. Essentially, Gray code differs from regular binary because each integer differs from its immediate predecessor by only one digit, one move of one digit. So Gray opens his patent by foregrounding a problem that he sees in regular binary. It is a characteristic of the conventional binary number notation, he writes, that a value change of unity may be reflected in the binary number notation by a simultaneous change in several of the digits. Thus, for example, with 4 digits, the number 7 is represented by 0, 1, 1, 1, while the next number, 8, is represented by 1, 0, 0, 0. In the course of changing the value by 1 unit, each of the 4 digits has been changed. And following this, Gray posits an alternative system that looks like this. So the point is that there's only a single change in each successive number. So for example, in regular binary, the number 2 would be represented 0, 1, 0, but the number 1, 0, 0, 1. So you have to change 2 columns to change from 1 to 2. Gray's reorganization of binary around the minimal number of changes from number to number foregrounds the premise that Gray code is a system of counting designed with the materiality of computing machines in mind. The gap between abstract logic and its concrete computation by machines was the subject of enormous debates in the 1940s and 1950s, not least at the Macy conferences that Anna mentioned, that took place in New York between 1946 and 1952. This gap, the gap between abstract logic and kind of machine logic, is summed up by John von Neumann when he states in a 1952 lecture at the California Institute of Technology titled Probabilistic Logic and the Synthesis of Reliable Organisms from Unreliable Components that there is one important difference between ordinary logic and the automata which represent it. Time never occurs in logic, but every network or nervous system has a definite time lag between the input signal and the output response. A definite temporal sequence is always inherent in the operation of such a real system. And around the same time, von Neumann described the nervous system as an analog system that could be represented digitally. He also suggested that all real phenomena are continuous and that the digital is nothing more than a human conceptual frame applied to some of these continuous phenomena. This is in the conversation following one of the talks at the 6th Macy Conference. Because electronic machine computation is premised on a real system, it requires the movement of components that, due to their materiality, cannot be assumed to perfectly synchronize even when triggered by the same input. In such a system, avoiding the need for simultaneous switching dramatically reduces the possibility of errors. In other words, Gray code functions to ameliorate the possibility of accidents resulting from the difference between the abstract logic that computation is often taken to exemplify and the materiality of the machines that make this so-called abstract logic concretely possible. Appropriately, another name given to this type of code, the grey type code in the 1950s, was the minimum error code. By the 1990s, a specific variation of grey code had been added to computer science manuals. Titled the Beckett grey code, this variant was named for a combination of Frank Gray's name and that of the novelist, poet, and playwright Samuel Beckett. So Beckett grey codes are designed to process first in, last out queuing systems of the type exemplified in Beckett's 1981 television play, first broadcast in Germany, in fact. Beckett grey codes are designed... Oh, I'm repeating myself. Beckett is not usually theorized as a practitioner concerned with the practices or implications of digitality or even of technology, although he produced work for radio, film, and television that engaged with the specificities of those media. However, if one takes concepts and practices of quantification, computation, and their application to social life as formations that exist beyond computing machines, and if one takes these extensions as indices of broader historical forces that shape, as well as being shaped by computing machines, one realizes that Beckett had been engaging with digitality from his earliest prose works. So this passage from What, which Beckett began writing in 1942, it's his second novel, is exemplary of the author's persistent interest in algorithmic logic as it functions quite separately from computing machines. Mrs. Gorman called every Thursday, except when she was indisposed. Then she did not call, but stayed at home, in bed or in a comfortable chair, before the fire if the weather was cold, and by the open window if the weather was warm, and if the weather was neither cold nor warm, by the closed window or before the empty hearth. And essentially the entire novel, it's about a 300-page novel, is composed of these kind of branching logical possibilities. To exemplify the computational character of this text, in his 1987 book, The Mechanic Muse, the literary critic Hugh Kenner reformulated this passage, first in the programming language Pascal, and then as a natural language algorithm. This is actually kind of extraordinary that this work was happening in the 1980s, given how we normally periodize kind of digital humanities methods. So this is the Mrs. Gorman passage in Pascal, and then in a kind of natural language algorithm. This specific intersection between the concerns of computational logic and the concerns of aesthetic production that may not directly represent computing machines or computer use foregrounds what strikes me as an essential methodology for the analysis of contemporary culture. That a problem which appears in the work of a mid-century novelist and playwright can be considered a problem of computation in a very formal way, as in the Beckett grey code, points towards the complex relationship between digital culture and the dominant notion of the social that is the primary concern of this exhibition. So to count as a Beckett grey code, a sequence of numbers must meet, or a sequence must meet the following conditions. So all possible combinations are represented once. Each change of state must involve the entry or exit of a single bit or object or actor. And then thirdly, the departures of the various players must follow a first in, last out logic. And so here is the script of Quad, the television play from which the Beckett grey code took inspiration, I guess. And so you can see the structure of it. It's kind of straightforward. There's a square stage. The four corners are numbered A, B, C, D. There are 4 players, and each player has a course of actions. And their course of actions are basically diagrams directly below the square. So the idea is if they simply follow the instructions, they're enacting the play. And this is also in the script, it's this diagram of the directions of movement that are produced by this kind of algorithmic script. So to make this more concrete, I'm just going to play. So Beckett, when he was making the notes, when he was devising the script for Quad, calculated it as taking about 24 minutes to run, to execute, if you like, by these 4 players. but when it's actually been performed, it tends to be about 9 minutes long. So there's an enormous gulf between Beckett's projected timing of the piece and the time it takes to actually perform. So I'm going to show about a 5-minute clip of it. This is from a TV broadcast in the early 1980s. Give me a sound, thank you. On the one hand, the piece produces something like an intensified version of Taylorist work discipline. It calls to mind the computer-aided efficiency of the Amazon Fulfillment Center, this is what the Amazon warehouses are called, in which workers are guided to the next collection by software that combines a route-finding application and an extremely strict timer, software that, like the supply chains of such companies as Amazon, and like the logic of capital itself, appears to work on the principle that the worker and the items with which they must interact are virtual objects, or symbols in a system of pure logic, not subject to fatigue. But two things are especially interesting to me about this piece, Quad, in relation to the computational logic that the Beckett-Gray code emphasizes. So firstly, while Gray code has been mapped for 2, 5, 6, 7, and 8 objects, codes for 3 and 4 objects have yet to be found. In other words, the aesthetic work that provides the inspiration and the name for Beckett-Gray code cannot be modeled in Beckett-Gray code. Secondly, while the entry, exit, and movement patterns of the 4 actors can be reduced to an algorithm, to these courses of A, C, C, B, B, A, and so on, the physical presence of the bodies produces a problem that cannot be rendered algorithmically and to which the script of the play only vaguely gestures. The problem of what the actors do when they encounter each other at the center of the square. And so the idea is that they never break stride, that every single crossing takes exactly the same amount of time and they maintain an even pace. So this is from the very end of the script, a note problem, negotiation of E without rupture of rhythm when 3 or 4 players cross paths at this point, or if rupture is accepted, how to best exploit. I like how the question of how to best exploit is kept open, even though this problem basically can't be reduced to the script form of the piece. So, the play intersects with and exemplifies both the abstract ideal of computable human activity and the impossibility of fully tallying this computability to concrete reality. In the light of the Beckett-Gray code, the failures of algorithmic representation presented in Quad make me think of Friedrich Hitler's mantra, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. In the age of digital signal processing, only that which can be represented as a switching circuit is at all. I'm especially interested in the status of that which, by not being representable as a switching circuit, does not exist from the point of view of media systems such as capitalism. I'm also interested in the historical specificity of the points of view from which conditions of existent and non-existent are determined. As the nervous system exhibition shows, there's a close relationship between computation and the imagination, modelling, and management of the social. Because of this, the status of what, and more importantly who, it gets left out or suspended from these imaginaries, models, and management systems seems to be of primary importance today. So to return to the questions I raised at the outset of this talk, I'm interested in the ways in which we might be able to understand the relationship between inclusion and occlusion in interconnected systems of computation and capitalist accumulation. Because, as Hitler's mantra implies, that which is not included in a system of computation is not negligible or non-existent. Rather, it is a precondition for that system. Just as the logical form of software is only executable in hardware, making hardware-optimized encoding systems such as Gray code necessary, the coded movements that from one point of view make up the totality of Beckett's quad are only executable because there are material bodies through which they can be executed. And these bodies have access to a wider range of movements and non-movements from which they can select. Equally, even when following their coded schemas, A, C, C, B, and so on, the possibility of deviation is what makes the coded path thinkable, and most critically, is what makes code executable. The relationship between what is representable and thus valorizable through a system of computation is also shown here to be plastic rather than fixed. The problem of how to best exploit the interruptions imposed by the censor is kept open in the script. This relationship between excluded deviations and their centrality to a given system is phrased beautifully by Michel Serres when he writes in The Parasite that difference is part of the thing itself and perhaps even produces the thing. Maybe the radical origin of things is really that difference, even though classical rationalism damned it to hell. In the beginning was the noise. In Marx, this question of the outside that makes the system possible is explicitly connected to the production and management of surplus populations, or those deemed unproductive and thus excluded from relations of exchange. So Marx writes, the surplus population becomes the lever of capitalistic accumulation, nay, a condition of its existence of the capitalist mode of production. It forms a disposable industrial reserve army that belongs to capital quite as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. Independently of the limits of the actual increase of population, it creates, for the changing needs of the self-expansion of capital, a massive human activity, massive human material, always ready for exploitation. This constitutive function of excluded bodies has been taken up by a number of later Marxian thinkers. Rosa Luxemburg phrases the problem in these terms: capitalism in its full maturity depends in all respects on non-capitalist strata and social organisations existing side by side with it. While more recently the Endnotes Collective writes that there must be an exterior to value in order for value to exist. Similarly, for labour to exist and to serve as the measure of value, there must be an exterior to labour. The constitutive exclusion takes a number of forms in relation to capitalist accumulation. There is, of course, that which is left out by the compression of lived life or human activity into the specific form of labour that produces surplus value, the same compression that renders the worker dot-like, in Marx's words. But there's also the colonisation of land, bodies and minds so that new raw materials and new spaces for expansion can be added to existing networks. There is the objectification of people into saleable commodities in the form of slavery and the growing sectors of private incarceration and institutionalisation that are somehow grouped under the category of service industries. There are the range of so-called unproductive forms of labour that are required to reproduce the ostensibly productive workforce, from childbirth and childcare to cooking, cleaning and other forms of care work. So while it's important to think through the ways in which digital technologies for the quantification of social activity intensify and even mutate the fundamental protocols of accumulation, it's also important to think through the ways in which forms of life that remain unquantified make these protocols possible, as well as the forms of violence that persist around the boundary between the two. Another passage from Frederick Douglass makes clear the ways in which these unquantified but essential activities or bodies often agglomerate in ways that emphasize the race and gendered violence of capital. If any one thing in my experience, more than another, served to deepen my conviction that in the infernal character of slavery and to fill me with unutterable loathing of slaveholders, it was their base ingratitude to my poor old grandmother. She had served my old master faithfully from youth to old age. She had been the source of all his wealth. She had peopled his plantation with slaves. She had become a great-grandmother in his service. She had rocked him in infancy, attended him in childhood, served him through life, and at his death wiped from his icy brow the cold death sweat. She was nevertheless left a slave for life, a slave in the hands of strangers, and in their hands she saw her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren divided, like so many sheep, without being gratified with the small privilege of a single word out of their or her own destiny. So when we think about quantification, digitality, and sociality, and when we think about the ways in which contemporary art engages with, represents, and critiques the intersections of these terms, we might also think about the stakes of quantification, the structural impossibility of full inclusion that grounds both digital mediation and capital, the protocols through which conditions of representability, computability, and inclusion are decided upon and allocated, and the longer histories of race and gendered exclusion and suspension upon which the so-called information age is premised. Thanks.